Thank you so much for that reading. We're going to move on to the reflection part of our reading. And I'm going to ask you some questions based on the questions that I've asked the women who you read for. So the first question is, what is your name? When were you born? And where were you born? And where do you currently live now?
So my name is Dara, and I was born in 1980, and I was born in Dublin in Ireland, and now I live in London in the UK.
My name is Franklin, and I was born in 1990. I was born in Brooklyn, New York, and I am where I am now because I just wanted someplace that wasn't as crazy as New York City.
Fair.
My name is Nika. I was born in 1983 in Los Angeles, and I currently live in Brooklyn.
Thank you. My second question is about your kind of origin stories, but not yours, your elders. So where, if you know, were your parents from? Where are they from? Where were they born? And tell me a little bit about how you arrived in the place you currently live.
So both my parents are from Dublin, and I came to London, I suppose, via traveling to many other places. I left Ireland when I was in my early 20s, spent some time traveling, went to New York to do a PhD for 9 years, and then my visa expired after the postdoc, so I sort of had a bit of time Goldilocksing around Europe to find a place to be, and then London kind of has been that place for the last 4 years.
Both of my parents are from Panama, and they came here in their 20s and late teens, and we have lived in New York for the majority of our lives. And I still partially do half the month, so not really in Georgia, but I came here because it was the quiet life, like I said before, and I wanted something like a juxtaposition between the hectic life I led before and something a little calmer. So that's how I ended up here.
Both of my parents are from New York. My mom is from Queens, and my father is from Brooklyn. And they were born and raised there. My mom did a short stint of her childhood in Las Vegas. My grandfather was a singer, so that's, he did a short stint in Vegas, and that's what you do. So yeah, it's yeah.
So I'm going to add a question to this because I spoke to Indigenous women and Black women and women who identify as immigrants. And the additional question is, if you know, if you don't know, it's fine. But do you know how your ancestors arrived to, say, Ireland or to the Americas?
I'm sorry, I can't hear you guys.
Can you hear me now, Franklin?
Yes, I can.
Okay, excellent. So my question, I'm asking about if you know how your ancestors arrived in the continent that, or the island, right, that your parents found themselves, right? So Franklin, do you know approximately when or how your ancestors arrived in Panama? Dara, do you know how or when approximately your ancestors arrived in Ireland? And Nika, do you know how or when your ancestors arrived in North America?
So me first, right? Yeah. No, I guess is the answer. I suppose one of my aunts did like a family tree thing that went back, like trace family, I guess, through like about 400 years, and it was sort of, I guess, like obviously different parts of Ireland, but like it was all sort of within Ireland, or I think I can't remember how like exactly, but like it was quite like, or maybe it wasn't. Maybe I'm making that up, but anyway, it was definitely like I don't know, beyond whatever misty point like that stopped.
colonization is never a good thing, but fortunately they keep really good records. So I was able to trace them coming to Panama in the 1880s, and I was able to trace because the British Empire extended so vastly. Before that, I was able to trace them up to 400 years, which is rare for somebody of color. So I was very fortunate in that aspect.
I am a Sicilian Jew. So my mother's side came, early, that's the Jewish side, like early 1900s, like basically Fiddler on the Roof. That happened to them as well. So they had to get out, except it was a shtetl in, I think it's in Poland now, but the borders have moved so many times, like nobody really knows what country the shtetl is in now. And the Sicilians came sort of around the same time, I think, but I think under less dire circumstances. And like, so yeah, I am that, like, Lower East Side and out. Classic story.
Thank you. My next question is about the events of your parents, specifically your mother's generation. I asked these women about the 1971 War of Liberation that led to the independence of Bangladesh. And so Bangladesh is a relatively young nation. What would you say is the formative event of your mother's generation, or events? And like, tell me about the decades.
Yeah, I suppose I was trying to think how my mum would answer that. I'm not. I suppose like my first thought was maybe the Troubles in Northern Ireland, as sort of specifically in the '70s, sort of as being a huge background for when I guess my parents would have been in their 20s then. But I feel like they might equally say something about the Beatles as like being the big event. I don't know. So yeah, somewhere between those two things.
Derek, did your mom talk about those moments in her life? Like, are you guessing based on things that she's told you, or you're guessing based on like your understanding of history?
Maybe more my understanding of history than having conversations with my parents about it.
I think my mom, my dad was never really vocal too much about it. Only he would like chip in with my mom, like, but she was leading the conversation concerning that. And he was just like, yeah, I agree. Towards the end of it, but it ranged between a couple of decades, because I think even though Panama wasn't colonized by the Americans, the canal zone was, where the canal was. So there was an immense amount of privilege that you received if you lived in that area. And that's where my family lived, and which is why we were able to come to America. And so discussion of another country owning a very lucrative part of another country was always an issue, as well as the issue with Manuel Noriega being taken out of office. Even if he was a dictator, he's our dictator. Like, it's similar to somebody saying you don't like Trump and coming in and lifting him out of the White House and like, you're done, So it was a very similar type of conversation of like, this is a sovereign nation. You're not supposed to be able to take out, without the international community, a leader of a sovereign country like that. So that was a point of contention still is. She still hasn't stopped talking about it.
What decade would that be, or what year?
Okay, so the whole canal zone issue was like 1970s. Like that's when they were in discussions to hand it over in '99. And then Noriega was in the 80s. I think it was like 86 or 87 or something like that.
And Derek, the Troubles, what decades were that?
Well, '70s, I guess, was when I was thinking about it, but yeah. Continuing, I guess, or continued.
Yeah.
It's sort of interesting. My parents are 10 years apart, so they historical touch points are this, like, they have such different views of the same historical touch points, which I think is super interesting. But I feel like for my mom, it would have to be Kennedy.
Mm-hmm.
You know, she was born in 1949, so that was 1963. That's like, I feel like such a fixed point in time, if we're going to talk about it like Doctor Who, that like it's such a defining moment of like the end of what people thought America was, or at least the image of what America was being projected to the world as, without, I don't know. So that was the first thing I thought of.
It's amazing. Like, the reason why I wanted to know the decades is like, so for these women, it was the 1971 War of Liberation. And then prior to that, it's the independence movement, right? And then post the war, it's reconstructing, the country. And there was a famine. And a lot of people left, as they did as well. They left not too long after the war. So it's always amazing to hear, like, what's happening in the world. Just in our family history is what's happening in the world. So the next question is, it's a harder question. I mean, I know all of these questions are somewhat challenging. This question is about burial. So this is a conversation, like this conversation I had with my mom and the aunties is not, the first time I've spoken to them about it, which is why, it was very easy for them to speak with me. And it's a conversation that I've heard growing up. And like, as my mom says, like, she was very involved in preparing the dead and bathing women for burial. So it was something that I heard her speak about quite a lot. Is this a conversation that you've had with your own elders? Have you had this conversation? If you haven't, like, how do you imagine it might go? Or is this just not something that, as somebody in another reading said, is that appropriate to speak about?
Yeah, this is, I guess, a heavy question. I have had these conversations, or I suppose the thing that brings up for me particularly is sort of talking to both my grannies who have now passed about this, and particularly one of them. I suppose she worked as a nurse, and sort of really had thought a lot about burial and the moment of death. And for her, I suppose it's kind of a little bit of a sad thing in Ireland that used to be more like a wakes you would have, where there would sort of be a really community moment of like people would be with the body. And I think that's what she remembered as sort of like this really important ritual of a celebration of saying goodbye. And for me, I really associate like Samhain, which is Irish Halloween, where you sort of open the window and light a candle and sort of like open the space between the living and the dead is a bit thinner, remembering between the living and the dead then, like in that tradition. So so she, I think, was really a bit upset about the idea of like being left on her own when she was when she died, and she had talked a lot to me about it, and like so it did to become a bit of a point of difficulty when she did die, because I guess I had sort of been a person who had talked to her about it, and there was some difficulty. Yeah, it was hard with the church and with my parents and sort of with people's other like ideas of what should happen at that moment, and so I felt a really difficult space, I guess, to negotiate. Like for me, it was like sort of being between like my parents and then what my granny had said and what the church was saying. Anyway, so that was like hard, I would say, and I think that's like a bit of like a tricky thing. But I suppose the one thing she had made clear to everyone was that she wanted to be cremated, so that happened, and that was good. And and I suppose I've had those conversations, like, where my siblings and I guess have talked to our parents about it a little bit, and like I think it's quite I suppose important to sort of know what people's ideas are. I suppose it does, like, talking about with your play makes me a little bit sad, I suppose, in some ways, in that, like, I think particularly, I guess, in an Irish context, about having those moments of like celebrating a life, and I think we've maybe lost some of that, and certainly at the moment because of the pandemic we're really removed from that. And so I think, I know feel like there's a lot of like collective grief that hasn't been processed yet about this moment, and I feel like sort of holding that. Anyway, that's me. Sorry, that's a long answer.
With my family, I don't know, like we're such an odd bunch. You know, we're like, if I was gonna talk about us, like I would say like we're a little bit bougie, but like a little bit Afro-Latino Adams family.
Yeah.
You know? Like where the macabre doesn't really like do things to us. Like my dad died like 4 years ago, right? At the funeral, you know, I'm looking at his body, and the guy that's supposed to say something for my dad, he's running late. And my mother was like, oh my God, he's running late. I'm like, he's not going anywhere. Okay. And she looked at me and she just cracked up because she was like, I cannot take you anywhere. Even at your father's funeral, you were still telling a joke. And I'm like, well, what are we going to do? You know, this is where we're at right now. And I'm like, he would appreciate this humor. That's like celebrating his life. So, you know, and my mom is this very similar. She's like, I don't want any of your tias or tias crying over my casket. So the minute I die, throw me into the oven, call it a day, tell them a day later that I died, have a party, and that's it. I don't want any tears. I don't want any fake people. I don't want them coming and saying, oh, what a wonderful lady she was. None of it. So we've had these discussions since I was a kid, like on like the kitchen table and cracking up. Even
Oh, we've lost you.
Franklin, you're saying something amazing and I can't hear you. And he doesn't hear me either.
I know.
Franklin, can you hear me? Oh no, he's going on. Franklin, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, so
where did I go out?
Where did he go out, guys?
The last thing that I think was your Tia and saying like no fake people. That's the last thing I remember.
Yeah, so no fake people, no crying over the casket. She's like, throw me in the oven, call it a day. And so I'm kind of like the same way. I'm like, don't tell anybody until you throw me in the oven. Then you can tell them that I'm not here anymore. Because I don't want anybody coming, oh my God, he's such a great guy, da 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 da, or you know, and not meaning it. So, and these are the type of conversations that we had on our kitchen table. And I think as a child, it made me less afraid because I think people may not necessarily be afraid of death. They're afraid of not accomplishing what they came here to do. And so it made me not feel that way. So I guess I kind of have a different approach to it because of that upbringing. But either way, it's still sad. But, you know, my family's tradition is to throw humor on top of it, you know, so. Frozen.
Oh no, you froze again.
I can hear you. I can see you.
Okay, good.
Internet is out to get us today. We are also a little bit gallows humory in my family as well. But it's also it's interesting because at least my mom's side of the family is the side that I am closer to. So like most of my references will come that way. Our generations are spaced really far apart. So I'm an only child, and the next person in my generation of all of their first cousins is 19. And then there's a 15-year-old, and then there's a 4-year-old. So that's it for my entire generation. So I feel like, and, you know, I have other cousins who didn't have children, and it's not something I'm planning on doing either, but I know that, like, I feel like a lot of the responsibility for more than just my parents is going to fall to me in a way, and now I feel like I have to have this conversation with more people, and, like, great. But every now and, like, every few years, my parents will get, like, really organized about something, and, like, I will get a phone call. My favorite phone call is from my mom, and she called, and without saying hello, she said, "We're shredding." I said, "What do you mean? What do you mean you're shredding?" She said, "We're shredding so you won't have to." gone into the garage and they were pulling out like boxes of old tax returns that like no one needed to save anymore, and they were shredding like 30 years worth of stuff because like they hoard, but not in a hoarder's way. They just keep things. And that was my favorite one, was we're shredding so you don't have to. Or like I'll get an email that's like, here's the will, put it on a hard drive. Like out of nowhere. There's no but we've never actually had the conversation of like, what would you like me to do with your actual body?
Well, I have to say that I didn't know, like when, the 12-year-old, she volunteered. So I was like, yeah, sure, you can do this reading. And then I thought about it after doing the first reading. I was like, oh, how is this going to be for a 12-year-old? And then after we finished, the 12 and 13-year-old, they were like, we never thought our parents were interesting people, but now we think that they could be interesting. And and then they were like, we should ask them. So I realized, after the reading, their kids are going to be like, so where would you like to be buried, Mom and Dad? They already signed the release form, so I'm good.
They're gonna be like, my kids are trying to off me.
So my next question is, as you're reading the script, is there anything that you were like, yeah, I could see my mom saying that, or I can see myself saying that? And you can look at the script.
Yeah, might be helpful. I think some of the conversations around, I mean, to be honest, I guess I imagine my granny saying it more than my mum. But I think,
like what?
Like I guess some of the stuff about like we didn't have this television, or you could like I guess some of the sharpness of Nazreen reminded me of my grannies. But in terms of my mum, maybe the stuff about politics, sort of, I guess, like some of the stuff about voting, and sorry, I'm just scrolling through now. Yeah, I suppose, and maybe some of the stuff about the pandemic and sort of the difficulties of not being able to bury. I know my parents don't have a car, and so I was talking to my mum about she hadn't been to her mum's grave in months, and so she went like last week because someone gave her a lift, and it was like, yeah, pretty hard because it was not. So I think like some of that stuff, like or the lines, I guess, about the pandemic, maybe. And then I think it's sort of, a lot of it would be quite different to my mum's experience in terms of like she still lives like basically within walking distance of where she was born, so sort of that the elements of being sort of like dislocation and migration, like I think it's a bit maybe like some of it a little bit reminds me of sort of maybe my grandparents moving from sort of the west of Ireland to Dublin, right? Sort of that you have that element of like feeling displacement, or sort of like sadness about being away from the place where you grew up, even though obviously it's a lot closer in a different context.
A lot of it resonated with me. I think there are themes that are with the struggle of being an immigrant, right? And I kind of quite a bit resonated, with me, and the names were different, but some of those parts I could have switched out the names for places in Panama, and those same kind of conversations are happening. What's home, what survival looks like, what's safer, is survival here, or should you go back home, and when you come here, do you lose that connection to home? Like, can you go back once you've come here? Because now you've been Americanized. Like, what does that mean when you go back home? And are you looked as an other now because you've been Americanized? So that resonated with me. But there was one part, Hasna, your mom, was saying about where her priorities are, and I think my mother would say the same thing. Like, her priorities are here, This is where her immediate family is. This is where she's earns her money. You know, she still sends home to cousins in Panama, but this is her first priority. And I think you live in that interstitial space where you kind of don't have a home
Mhm.
because you exist in two locations, your past and your present, and then you are there somewhere in between. So I thought that was very interesting.
Oh. Um, this, I think our moms would probably have a great deal to talk about, Sahar. Um, the thing that resonated the most with me that I could hear in my own mother's words is like when you respond, and so it's good to be good to the people around you, right? Like that's where my mom lives all the time, is like, how can I be helpful? um when I was raised, and she was also raised with the same sort of phrase beaten into all of our heads, that to those whom much is given, much is required. And that if you're not, basically, like, if you're not using your privilege to free other people or to be doing something good, then we'll sort of, why are you taking up space in the world a little bit? And that when you say, so it's good to be good to the people around you, and leaving behind righteous people, and your priorities being where you are, like, it's almost like I pictured it like rippling out, like where your priorities live, and wanting to sort of hold all of that in the same place, but only being able to sort of do not necessarily one thing at a time, but like one layer at a time sometimes, if that makes sense at all. And there are a couple of other things, in that Dan's grandmother actually passed away fairly recently, and this was the funeral business was her business. Dan's mother, Dan is my husband who went to high school with Sahar. His mother grew up in a funeral home, and like, so his grandmother like had everything planned out. Like, she knew what she wanted to wear, she knew what she wanted to happen to her, like she had it planned out. And it was like so devastating that no one could be there, like to like see her do the thing that like was her business for so long, that like she knew exactly what she wanted to happen. And like it was really devastating that like we couldn't be there. So that got me. There was one other thing, and now I can't remember it. Sorry.
Okay, it's good. We have 5 more minutes left, and I have 2 more questions. If it ends, I'm just going to ask you to hop back in. Oh, I can't wait to write the notes about this. um, so the second to last question is the last question that the second to last question I asked the ladies. If someone were to approach you now, considering all that we know about what the pandemic has revealed, about things about the structures of the United States and about the United Kingdom, and with the uprisings for Black lives that are happening across the country and across the globe, and they were to reach out to you and tell you they'd like to immigrate to where you live, how would you respond?
I think the responses, I think that Nazreen gave are quite sharp and pointed and resonated a lot, right, in terms of this question, for me personally. But yeah, I think I would say I guess in terms of the UK and the US, there's certainly some similarities, right, in that they're both places that are like unfortunately seeing the sort of rise of white supremacy and racism, and here in the UK I work with migrants and survivors of torture, and I think like, I guess I've asked this question, Rob, written this question to them sometimes, and their responses have been really mixed, I guess. And so I think I might maybe take my lead from that, as like some of them are sort of in different stages of the asylum process, and like I think for like I guess some kind of message of like there's definitely space for you. Unfortunately, there will be some welcome, but also like the conditions of like having to live off £37 a week until you get your application. I mean, one of the people I work with is 25. He came over here on a lorry when he was 16. He's been waiting 9 years, and he's been living on that like since then. So his whole childhood has been stolen from this racist immigration system, as well as sort of having to deal with all sorts of stuff. So I don't I feel like there's a lot to be challenged and done, and I guess it's exciting to see sort of the Black Lives Matter movement sort of really give power also to sort of pushing against the hostile environment here and sort of racist policies in the US as well. So yeah, I mean, it's interesting to talk to my Irish relatives here in terms of this question, who moved to London in the 60s, when like they faced quite a lot of discrimination for being Irish, and so obviously that narrative has really shifted in sort of, and I think maybe I said this to you before, Sahar, but like one of my Irish aunties who's quite right wing, and we would definitely have very different politics, but I was sort of really surprised, I guess, and impressed with the way that she sort of she was like, well, what they're doing to Muslim people here now, that's what they did to Irish people when I came here. And, and she had to change her accent when she spoke, for example, those kind of things, which I think are really, have obviously shifted. And so I suppose maybe a hopeful version of like to coming here is that like, yeah, I think both the UK and the US need more people to challenge these systems, and obviously that burden shouldn't be on the people who are coming to the country. But I think there's also an emerging space for that. Sorry, I'm rambling now. I'll stop. But yeah, something like that.
I'm going to say instead of Zoom interrupting us, let's sign out and sign back in.
Okay.
Yeah, let's do that.